Let's dive back into types of scientific questions. Remember, we're talking about the general category of statistical questions that we're answering in a particular medical research study. In this lecture, we're going to focus on inferential and predictive questions. So remember, in the previous lecture, we looked at descriptive and exploratory questions, where we were just trying to see in a particular population or in a particular sample, do we observe a relationship at all? Now what we're going to try to do is take that information that we've collected from a sample and try to see if we can infer something about a broader population. So remember that the questions we already asked was, did they summarize the data? And so the answer to that was yes, they summarized the data for this study. Did they report those summaries without interpretation? No, they definitely did interpret that. So we're going to move on to the next question. And then they asked, did they quantify whether the discoveries are likely to hold in a new sample? If the answer to this is yes, we're now in sort of the broad category of statistical questions that people commonly think of when they think of statistics in the medical literature. So now the question we want to ask ourselves is, are they actually trying to measure a causal effect? In other words, are they trying to figure out if I change the dosage by this much, how much is the outcome going to change directly? If they are able to do that, then it's a causal or mechanistic study, and we'll talk about that in the next lecture. If they aren't able to do that, then we're in the class of inferential or predictive questions. And the way to separate these two things out is to ask yourself the question, are they trying to predict measurements for a single individual? If the answer is no, then they're talking about an inferential question. You're trying to say something about the relationships between two variables in a broad population, but you're not trying to make a prediction for an individual. So this picture summarizes the key idea in all of inferential statistics. The basic idea is it's too expensive or too complicated to measure something on the entire population. In this case, there are 18 people, and suppose it's extremely expensive to measure their color and whether they're wearing a bow tie or not. Then what we would do is we would take a small random sample, we would use probability to do that, and in that small random sample, we would be able to measure whether they have a bow tie or whether they're green or whether they're purple. Once we have that information, we might observe a relationship. For example, we see that all the green people are wearing bow ties in our sample. So what we want to do is try to make some kind of claim about the broader population. How many people in the broader population are green and wear bow ties? Well, based on our sample, we might think between 80% and 100% of all bow tie wearers are green. That answer might be right, or it might be wrong. It'll depend on how well we did the sampling and took the small sample from the population. It will depend on the statistical techniques that we use to make that claim from the small sample to the population, and it will depend on the types of internal and external validity that you'll learn about in other lectures. Here's an example of an inferential analysis in the literature. So here we're looking at trazodone use and the risk of dementia. So this is a cohort study where they followed a group of people over time. And what they're looking for is, if we vary the dose of this drug, do we see a differential response in terms of dementia? So this is an example from the paper where they show the hazard ratios, which tells you something about the relationship between trazodone use and how frequently people get dementia. So what they're doing is they're reporting a hazard ratio. That's what they observe in that single sample. Then they report a confidence interval and a p-value. The confidence interval says something about, well, in this single sample, we observed a hazard ratio, say of 1.8. But what do we expect that hazard ratio to be in the entire population? The confidence interval tells you something about our uncertainty because we took a sample and we didn't get to observe the whole population. And the p-value also tells you something about our certainty about how strong that relationship between trazodone use and dementia is. So this is a type of study where we're trying to say something broadly about the relationship between trazodone use and dementia in the population. But for any individual person, we're not necessarily trying to predict, if I give you this drug, will you get dementia or not? So the second type of analysis that's sort of in this population scale analysis is a predictive analysis. It's also sometimes what people call machine learning or classification. The idea here is you have a measurement and you're trying to predict something new for a single individual. So here's a cartoon example of that. Imagine we have our sample in the population of meeple, and we take that random sample with a probability, and we get 2 green meeple with bow ties and 1 purple meeple. Now with prediction, what we're trying to do is build a function that says, okay, based on one of the characteristics in our sample, can we predict another one? So in this case, for example, we're saying, can we build a function that says, if you have a bow tie, what color do we think you are? In this case, we've observed that almost everyone with that has a bow tie is green. So our prediction function might be something simple like, if we observe you have a bow tie, we're going to predict that you're a green meeple. And if you don't have a bow tie, we're going to predict that you're a purple meeple. Now, this prediction, again, could be good or bad depending on how well we've sampled from the population, if there are any biases in doing that, and how good a prediction function we can build. Here's an example from the literature of a predictive analysis. So here, the individuals that conducted this study are trying to predict whether someone had autism based on looking at home video of that person and predicting whether that home video says something about the way that they move and whether that way that they move can tell whether they're having an onset of autism. So what they do is they show videos to people, and the features from those videos that they extract are having people rate particular social interactions or rate particular ways that people act in those videos. They take those features and then they run them through a function, again, to make a prediction. Is this individual have autism or do they not have autism? And then they can evaluate in another sample, how well does that prediction function work? In other words, how frequently when people do have autism do we detect it? And how frequently when they don't have autism do we say that they don't have autism? So this is a predictive analysis, and the difference between this and an inferential analysis is we're trying to predict for a single individual what's going on. So we've covered now descriptive and exploratory, inferential and predictive analysis. In the next lecture, we'll cover causal and mechanistic analyses, which